Hello and welcome to this video on the consolidation of power. Now technically this goes across two of the units and we're going to be in this one video thinking about 3.4, which is all about the political developments and how Hitler established a dictatorship by the time we get to March 1933, or at least how far he'd got by that time. And then we're also going to be thinking about 4.1, which is about the later stages of consolidation of power, from things like the Enabling Act all the way up to the death of President Hindenburg. Before you begin watching the video, it'd be a really good idea for you to actually see how much you know about this topic already. So without looking at any of your notes, brainstorm everything you can about this topic and how Hitler went from being the Chancellor of Germany in January 1933 to being the dictator of Germany by the time we get to August 1934. So you could brainstorm about all of the different events, about why they were important. You could even try and draw links between different events, think about different themes that we talked about in lesson. Lots of different ideas here, and there's a few tips on here if you're stuck. Before we begin talking through the content, we're going to think about the exam focus and what they could actually ask you in an exam about this topic. Now, in the past, they've only asked one exam question about this, and it is focused on the methods. So they won't ask you to write an essay in chronological order. They'll ask you to think about the different themes or methods of how Hitler was able to establish a dictatorship. And basically, there are three that we need to know about. We need to know about things like compromise, we need to know about how he used terror, and we also need to know about how he used legal methods as well. And you can see two examples here of questions that are focused on those kind of themes. So for instance, this first one says, to what extent did the Nazi regime rely on terror and violence to consolidate its hold on power between the years 1933 and 1934? And obviously you'd have to think about terror and violence, but then you'd also think about legal methods and also compromise as well. However, I would be surprised if they did this, but they could ask you about who was responsible for the foundation of the dictatorship. So this has never come up in a past exam question before, even on the previous spec, but it's always good to be prepared anyway. So for instance, they could ask you something like, to what extent was it the conservative elites who helped create a Nazi dictatorship? Or they might ask you about things like, to what extent was it the SA or the army? And those kind of things. So they could technically ask you about who and different groups rather than asking you about things like terror and violence. So be prepared for both, and this video will help you with that. As you already know, this unit starts in January 1933 when Hitler's become Chancellor. If you need a bit of a refresher on how he became Chancellor and all the different reasons that led to it, including the backstairs intrigue, make sure you go back and watch video 3.3. To begin with then, we're going to think about the strengths and weaknesses of his position. So he'd been asked to be the Chancellor in January by President Hindenburg, who had been convinced by people like his son Oscar and also von Papen that Hitler was somebody that they could control. So they let him be Chancellor in January. Now, when Hitler became the Chancellor, he was happy because there were lots of strengths of that position, lots of positives of that position for him. For instance, technically, Hitler had become the second most powerful man in Germany. So obviously, the president was at the top, if we're thinking about kind of power structures, and then the Chancellor was the second most powerful and technically in charge of the day-to-day government and the Reichstag. So it was a good position to be in. Hitler also had a couple of Nazis in the main cabinet as well, including Frick, who was Minister of the Interior and therefore responsible for domestic affairs. And we also had Goering, who was the Minister of the Interior in Prussia and in charge of the police, which allowed him to establish things like the Gestapo in April 1933. And he was also the Minister without portfolio as well. In terms of other strengths, obviously being the Chancellor and being the largest party in the Reichstag did give the Nazis some advantages as well. So now their actions in terms of things like the SA had gained some legal authority, and they also gained the resources of the state when he became Chancellor as well, being able to do things like having influence over radio and the press. And even though the Nazis actually lost support in the last election, which had taken place in November 1932, they still were the largest party in the Reichstag, and this convinced the Conservatives that they had to work with Hitler and the rest of the Nazi party. Obviously, they tried to avoid using them before, but that had just led to the political chaos between 1930 and 1932, with so many different chancellors being very short-lived. So there were lots of strengths of that position in January 1933, but there were also lots of weaknesses, and Hitler had to overcome these if he wanted to become the dictator of Germany, which he obviously was by the time we get to August 1934. So in terms of the weaknesses, the conservative elites, people like Papen and Hindenburg, believed that they would be able to push Hitler into a corner so much that he'd be squeaking like a mouse, because they thought that he was politically inexperienced, and they also thought they could control him because the Nazis technically only had 3 posts out of the 12 cabinet posts available. Therefore, they believed it was going to be very difficult for them to make fundamental political change when there was such a limited amount of Nazis in the cabinet. Remember also that even though Hitler is the second most powerful man in Germany, Hindenburg is the president, and the president does get to choose who is the Chancellor of Germany. And therefore, Hindenburg could still sack Hitler at any point, just like he'd done with people like Brüning and Schleicher and Papen in the years before. So basically, the position of Chancellor was dependent on Hindenburg. And remember that Hindenburg didn't actually like Hitler or the Nazi Party. So therefore, it would be very easy to remove them. The army, who was also loyal to Hindenburg, was also still very unsure about Hitler and could remove him from power by force if Hindenburg asked them to. And there's also some problems still with the left wing, and groups that were quite powerful in Germany, like the trade unions, still didn't like the Nazis at this point, and they could do things like going on strike, which might then lead to Hindenburg sacking Hitler. So he definitely wasn't in a perfect position in January 1933, and it's important that you know some of those strengths and weaknesses of that position. As you know, Hitler established a dictatorship by the time we get to the 2nd of August 1934. Now, this was a long and complicated process. There were lots of different stepping stones that helped Hitler, but they basically all interconnected to allow him to create those circumstances by August 1934. And there were lots of different methods that were kind of interwoven that helped Hitler. Now, we're going to be thinking about different themes and thinking about the use of compromise, legal methods, and terror in today's PowerPoint. But it's also worth bearing in mind that there are kind of outside factors that influence this as well. For instance, things like the policy of Gleichschaltung, things like their use of propaganda, and things like the Nazis' wide appeal. So this is quite a good diagram for giving you a bit of an overview of it, but there are 3 themes that you need to know really, really well, and that is going to be terror, his use of concessions or compromise, and the use of legal methods as well. As I just mentioned, we're going to be thinking about 3 different methods and how Hitler used them to establish a dictatorship. Now, when I go through those different methods, obviously I won't be able to go through them in chronological order because we're going to be thinking about it in a thematic way. And it's really important that you do that in an exam, because if you were to talk about events in just chronological order, the examiner would think that you didn't have a very good broad understanding. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through 3 slides of timelines of what happens in chronological order, and I would like you to just make sure that you have a really good understanding of how all of these different events take place and kind of the order that they go in. Once I've gone through it, it might be a good idea to actually complete your own revision activity of making a timeline on this. Obviously, you can use the information that's on the slide, but it would be worth maybe writing down a few more details and using things like your exercise book or using things like your textbook so that you've got a really good revision material that you'll be able to use for this topic. Once you've then done that timeline, you could even then colour code it into the different methods so that you've basically got this kind of perfect revision material ready for if this question ever comes up in a mock or a real exam. So I'm going to talk through the first bit, which is going to be thinking about 1933 up until the 5th of March. So obviously, as we already know, Hitler became the Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. The Nazis wanted to really mark that as a very important event in the fact that it was going to be a real change to German society, and they did that with the torchlight procession with over 100,000 people to try and kind of demonstrate that this was going to be a real change. Now, Hitler wanted to start straight away in getting an overall majority. As you already know, he was disappointed with the election result of November 1932, where his share of the vote decreased from the 37% or 230 seats that he had in July 1932 to going down to 33% or 196 seats that he had in November 1932. So he wanted a cool new election straight away, and he was really hoping that he would be able to establish the Nazis having this overall majority and being able to pass laws through the Reichstag with ease, which would be, no mean feat, no small feat really, because, there had been such difficulty with getting a majority the entire way through the Weimar Republic. So Hitler wanted to try and dissolve the Reichstag and call those new elections, which were going to be held on the 5th of March. He also then, a couple of days later, met with some senior army officers and leaders to try and outline plans for rearmament. Basically, he was very aware of the fact that the army could remove him from power at any point. He was very aware that the army liked having kind of control, and that the Nazi Party obviously had their own paramilitary groups of the SA and the SS. So he wanted to try and stress that he was on the side of the army, and he stressed to them that he was going to allow them to remain an important institution. He would support them with things like rearmament, that he wanted to expand German territory and that he needed them for that. And that was part of the so-called Pact of 1933 that Kershaw talks about, where he is basically trying to win over really important institutions in Germany. So once he's thought about trying to win over the army, he then works on trying to win over the big business leaders, because if he's going to fund rearmament and if he's going to help the economy to recover from the Great Depression and provide the work and bread that he's promised the German people, he's going to need the support of the big businesses. On the 20th of February, he ends up meeting with some of the big business leaders and is able to secure donations of 3 million Reichsmarks for the Nazi Party for the last couple of weeks of the election campaigns, because remember that the elections are taking place on the 5th of March. In return, Hitler has to stop the attacks on the large capitalist enterprises that have been going on by the SA, and he also has to talk to them about how he will basically weaken trade unions, which obviously he does by the time we get to May 1933. Now we come to a really crucial event that you need to know lots of detail about, and that is the Reichstag fire, which takes place on the 27th of February. Now, traditionally, that is seen as being the kind of first key stepping stone of Hitler establishing dictatorship, although, as you can see, there are lots of stages even before that where Hitler is kind of laying the groundwork ready to try and establish this dictatorship. So the 27th of February, the Reichstag fire, obviously the Reichstag building, the German parliament goes up in flames, and there's been lots of debate about who was actually responsible for this. Lots of investigations. It was basically assumed that the fire had been started in multiple places, but regardless of whether it had or not, the Nazis publicly blamed a young Dutch communist called Marinus Vendeloop, and they basically said that he was trying to start a communist revolution. Now, that really helped the Nazis because it really scared the middle classes, and some of the middle class people had been reluctant to vote for the Nazis before, but now that they could see the threat of the communists, they were more likely to vote for them, and that kind of is part of the reason why the Nazis managed to go from having 33% of the vote in November 1932 to getting 44% of the vote in March 1933. Obviously, the Reichstag fire is very important as well, because not only does it win the support of some of the middle class, which helps increase the Nazi share of the vote and gives them their highest share of the vote ever, but also Hitler is able to use it to be able to pass something called the emergency decree, officially called the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. And that's really important because it suspends lots of civil rights and is basically the start of Nazi terror. So really crucial, wouldn't have happened without the Reichstag fire. So then obviously we had those elections held on the 5th of March. The Nazis are actually very disappointed with the result because they've only got 44% of the vote, and therefore they had to form a coalition with the conservative right-wing party, the DNVP. So continuing with our timeline, still thinking about 1933, we're going to be thinking about from the 8th of March onwards. So 8th of March, we get the first permanent concentration camp established at Dachau. Now, they started with this one and then they had over 70 different camps by the time we get to the end of the year. This allows them to be able to arrest thousands of people and imprison them. And obviously they're using some of those powers that they've had from the emergency decree, the decree for the protection of people in the state that was passed the day after the Reichstag fire. For instance, they've arrested 10,000 people within 2 weeks of that law being passed. And by the time we get to July 1933, a few months after, they've arrested 26,789 people. Obviously, the large majority of those are left-wing, particularly the communists, but also some socialists as well. Now, they also try and establish their dictatorship by making greater use of propaganda, and Hitler orders there to be a new Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, which is to be established, and this is going to be run by Joseph Goebbels. It was tasked with enforcing Nazi ideology and controlled all aspects of cultural life. Don't worry if you don't know very much about that yet, because we're going to come back to that when we look at 4.2 and think about propaganda. Now, Hitler really wanted to try and make sure that he had an Enabling Act passed, that he basically would have greater powers than any other chancellor had ever had before him. But in order to do that, he's got to make sure that he doesn't alienate the conservative elites. Because if he alienates the conservatives, they could then put pressure on people like Hindenburg to basically sack Hitler. So he's got to proceed with some caution. And so Hitler organises a meeting which is at Potsdam and is sometimes known as, for instance, the Day of Potsdam or the Potsdam Meeting. Now, this is where Hitler meets with lots of conservative elites, including Hindenburg, also including Wilhelm II, the previous Kaiser of Germany's son. He also meets up with people like Papen here, and he basically agrees here that he is going to be kind of working with the conservative elites and that they are kind of the key power in Germany at this point. And this is really important, this meeting, because it kind of symbolically aligns National Socialism, Nazism, with the Conservatives, and also helps to kind of placate some of those middle-class people that are still a little bit unsure about the Nazis, because they can see that kind of these traditional figures that they've been supporters of are now kind of aligning with this Nazi party. So Hitler makes sure that they're okay with kind of what's going on. And then he ends up creating the Enabling Act on the 24th of March. So this is taking place at the Kroll Opera House, because obviously the Reichstag building has been very badly damaged by the fire. And Hitler basically gets this law passed, which says that he can pass whatever laws he wants for 4 years without consulting the Reichstag in order to try and deal with things like the communist threat. And that is passed by an overwhelming majority. It needed 2/3 to get passed, as it was such a fundamental change, but it's passed with 444 votes to 94 that say no to it. The only political party that say no are the SPD, and that is because the Centre Party compromised with the Nazis. Obviously, parties like the DNVP are already in coalition with them, and the Communist Party aren't even able to vote because they're not even allowed in the building to take that vote. So the Enabling Act, absolutely crucial. We'll come back to that. It's basically the legal establishment of a dictatorship. Obviously, could still be removed by Hindenburg at this point, but that's absolutely crucial because it's really a sign of what's to come. By the time we get to the 31st of March, Hitler then begins the process of centralising German government and basically making local governments less powerful. By the time we get to 7th of April, he's starting to work on trying to restructure the civil service. He proceeds with some caution at this point because he doesn't want to alienate these conservative groups, but he does do things like purging Jewish people from the civil servants and anybody that is too left-wing. By the time we get to May, he's working on his relationships with big businesses and does things like banning trade unions, and he replaces it with what he calls as a trade union, but it wasn't in reality because it wasn't in favour of the workers, and that is the DAF, or the German Labour Front. More about that when we look at Unit 4.3. By By the time we get to July, there is some massive progress made for Hitler in terms of establishing dictatorship and reducing opposition, because he ends up creating something called the law against the formation of new parties. Now, at this point, some of the parties have actually already voluntarily disbanded. Parties like the Catholic Centre Party have already voluntarily disbanded, and so the DNVP. The SPD has been banned since June. The communists have been arrested since February 1933. So there wasn't very many opponents left at this point, but still the Nazis are officially creating this dictatorship using the Enabling Act, getting rid of all other parties and all other competition essentially. So we've seen an enormous amount of progress by the time we get to July, and therefore the Nazis don't really need groups like the SA anymore. The SA have been so important in basically kind of destroying opposition to the Nazis and helping them get things like the Enabling Act passed. But now that they've banned all other political parties, the SA aren't really needed anymore. So essentially Hitler starts to limit their powers by the time we get to August 1933. He takes away things like their auxiliary police status, and this makes them quite restless and quite resentful of the Nazis. It makes them want a second revolution and to kind of keep the revolution going further. And this is when we start to get real kind of tension between Hitler and the SA and Rom, which will obviously lead to the Night of the Long Knives by the time we get to June 1934. So that's the end of what you need to know about for 1933. Essentially, it's only taken 7 months or so for Hitler to make an enormous amount of progress from being in a relatively weak position to being in a very strong position by the time we get to the summer of that year. Before we look at 1934, I'm just going to pause here for a second just to think about how much progress Hitler has made by the end of 1933, and just remind you as well of a key word that you'll need to know for exams, and that is the German word of Gleichschaltung, which means coordination or forcing into line, and it's basically the process by which the Nazis tried to control and coordinate all aspects of German society. Even things like the church, the army, the civil service, all of that is kind of part of Gleichschaltung. So we've seen that there has been a kind of radical political transformation of Germany by the time we get to the end of 1933. You know, Hitler has managed to get rid of much of the political opposition, especially when he passes the law against the formation of new parties in July 1933. He's managed to dismantle the Weimar Constitution with things like the Enabling Act. So there's been enormous progress, but it is worth bearing in mind that actually he hasn't completely achieved everything by the time we get to the end of 1933. For instance, there's been lots of compromise between the church and the Nazis, with things like the Concordat that was signed with the Catholic Church in July 1933 that agreed that Hitler would leave the Catholic youth organisations and schools alone, and in return the Catholic Centre Party would basically give Hitler a free hand in establishing dictatorship. They would dissolve themselves and they wouldn't cause any political drama. So technically the church have compromised with the Nazis, but they do still remain an independent organisation to the state. Same with businesses. You know, generally the business community was pretty supportive of the Nazis. Hitler still needed to make sure that he was basically kind of wooing their leaders. He still needed their help for rearmament and recovery from the Great Depression. And also when we think about the army, he has met with them and he's promised them that he's going to fund rearmament and all that kind of stuff, but they are still loyal to the president and they're still very wary of the military ambitions of the SA, who basically want to combine the SA and the army together. Last slide of the timeline, we're now going to think about what was Hitler doing in 1934. So at the start of 1934, he passes the law for the reconstruction of the Reich, which basically makes the government much more centralised. He'd begun that process back in March 1933, but here in 1934, he abolishes the state assemblies and the state governments and makes everything now more responsible to the federal government. So he has basically kind of destroyed local government, but he does have Nazi party leaders who are in charge of different local areas called the Gauleiters, and we'll talk more about them in the future. And the 14th of February, as part of that destroying of local government, he abolishes the Reichsrat. By the time we get to April 1933, it's worth bearing in mind that it is very clear to the conservative elites, to the government, to Hitler, that President Hindenburg's health is deteriorating. And there's a lot of tension going on at this point between the SA and the Conservatives. And this kind of comes to a head in June 1934. When we have something called the Marburg speech. And this is where Papen called for an end publicly to the SA excesses and criticised Hitler's policy of coordination, and basically criticised Hitler for not being able to try and control the SA very effectively. So this was a really key event because it basically highlighted to Hitler that there was lots of discontent in the conservative circles and that he needed to actually act on this before he lost their support and was removed from power, especially because it was very clear that Hindenburg wouldn't last that long, and therefore he needed kind of urgent action. So obviously he took that action on the 30th of June 1934 when we get the event of the Night of the Long Knives. And this is when some of the SA, the brown shirts, people that had been around since 1920 helping the Nazis to power, were murdered by members of the SS, the black shirts, Hitler's personal bodyguard that had been formed in 1925. Now, the numbers of how many people are killed over these couple of nights really does vary. It's traditionally seen as being around 400, but there were many other people arrested. Lots of people were murdered, including Rom, the leader of the SA, but also von Kahr, who you might remember betrayed Hitler in the Munich Putsch back in 1923. Now, soon after the events of the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler then meets with the Reichstag to address what had happened with the Night of the Long Knives, and he does this long speech where he talks about how he was the supreme judge of the German people and accepted full responsibility for the actions. But in terms of the response of the Reichstag and the German people, generally there's no repercussions from the Night of the Long Knives. If anything, Hitler benefits from this because people see him as being willing to do what's necessary and putting Germany first above even his own personal loyalty to people. So it's actually viewed quite well. And it means that when Hindenburg dies on the 2nd of August of lung cancer, Hitler is able to get the army to swear an oath of loyalty to him personally rather than to the country that they used to do. And after he's got the army oath of loyalty, after he's combined the roles of president and chancellor together to create the Führer, he holds a plebiscite to see if the German people approve, and 89.9% of the public vote in favour of this and say that they want Hitler to become the Führer, the supreme leader of Germany. So by the time we get to the 2nd of August, really, Hitler is now dictator of Germany thanks to this combination of terror, legal methods and compromise with the established conservative forces. If you are going to do a timeline, which would be a really good idea, you could pause the video here and remember add some extra details from your exercise books to make sure this is the best revision material possible. So you've had an overview of all of the different events that played a role in Hitler becoming dictator. We're now going to think about it in a thematic way so that you've basically got some idea of what your paragraphs would be if you were to do an exam question on this. So the reason that we're looking at it thematically is because there's been a massive debate amongst historians about what method was the most important in helping Hitler establish dictatorship. So as you already know, we're going to be thinking about compromise, legal methods and terror. And there is one historian who I just wanted to introduce you to here. Historians' views generally are embedded in this PowerPoint in red font. And a historian called Brasher declared back in the 1950s that Germany had experienced a legal revolution in 1933 that helped Hitler become a dictatorship. And I want you to bear in mind as you're listening to this information about whether you would agree it was a legal revolution or whether you would say actually other factors were more important than the legal steps to dictatorship. The first method of establishing dictatorship that we're going to look at is going to be about terror. So we're going to start with thinking about the Reichstag fire and its aftermath. Now, this happened on the 27th of February 1933, and it is fiercely debated who actually started this fire. You know, some people say it was the Nazis because the fire was set in multiple places. Some people say it was just van der Lubbe, who was found at the scene of the crime. And other people claim that the Nazis knew what van der Lubbe was planning, but they allowed it to happen because it suited their agenda. No matter what, no matter who was responsible, the fact is that the Reichstag building was set alight, and this was really shocking for the German public at the time. Hitler used this to his advantage to crush the communists and suspend key parts of the constitution, because he said that it was them signalling the start of a communist revolution, which did make ordinary people feel very scared in Germany. Think about the anti-communist feeling and hysteria that there was before. Even before the Nazis actually came to power. And so you can imagine that this would kind of play into those ideas that have already been circulating for a while. So it helped the Nazis because it allowed them to be able to pass the next day the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. Hindenburg would have never agreed to this if he didn't feel like there was a communist threat. So it was passed the day after, and really importantly, it suspended key constitutional rights of the German people. For instance, before, according to the constitution, they'd had things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. All of those are now taken away, and people could be arrested and put into protective custody for an unlimited period of time, even if there was no evidence against them. So the Nazis used this to arrest 4,000 communists in the week before the elections, because obviously remember those elections taking place on the 5th of March, or you could remember the statistic about how they arrested 10,000 within 2 weeks. Either of them is fine, obviously you don't need to know both. So this was then used to try and crush the communist opposition. It made it really hard for them to be able to get out any kind of propaganda, for there to be any kind of communist meetings before, and basically reduced their share of the vote from having about 16.9% of the vote, their highest ever in November 1932, to only getting 12% of the votes in this 1933 March election. So this is a really key event for terror. Whether the Nazis started it or not, we can't deny that this obviously had horrendous consequences for the left wing, who were so brutally arrested as a result of the emergency decree, or the Decree for Protection of People and the State. We're still going to be thinking about terror, but now we're going to think about SA violence. And remember that the SA had been created back in 1920, officially formed in 1921, and they had been a group that had helped the Nazis immensely over the years. Obviously, they had been the ones that had been involved in the Munich Putsch. The SS hadn't even existed at that point. They had been loyal to the Nazis and Hitler throughout, and they had played a really key role in helping the Nazis to become such a popular party, because they were the ones that were fighting the communists on the street, which made people feel as if the Nazi party were the only one that could handle the communists. They were also people that protected Nazi party meetings from being disrupted. So they had played a really key role previously, and they became the main instrument of terror in January 1933, where they were now used, now that Hitler was becoming Chancellor, to try and eliminate opposition and help Hitler retain his position as Chancellor. And they were really helped by the fact that when Hitler became Chancellor, they now gained legality for their actions. So they were now basically seen as this auxiliary or supportive police. They had the powers to arrest people, and they arrested many people. And by the time we get to July 1933, they've arrested 26,789 people and put them in a lot of the new concentration camps that they have by March 1933. Obviously we have things like Dachau. By the end of that year, there are over 70 camps in Germany. This is another good example if you were looking for more statistics to kind of prove the role of the SA and the violence that they were involved in. They encountered lots of armed resistance from the SPD, and so they ended up arresting 500 left-wing people and torturing them so badly that 91 died. So that kind of shows the terror and how effective they were horrendously at reducing left-wing opposition. And it's estimated that in 1933 alone, there were 500 murders carried out by the SA. So they were a really crucial group at first in helping Hitler establish his dictatorship by getting rid of political opposition. Were also really important when it came to things like getting the Enabling Act passed. Now, we'll talk more about the Enabling Act when we look at legal methods. And remember, this is where Hitler had the power to pass whatever laws he wanted for 4 years. But he would have never got that act passed if it hadn't been for the role of the SA. Because the SA stopped the KPD members getting into the Kroll Opera House to do the vote, and they also intimidated other people into supporting the Nazis and voting in favour of the Enabling Act. And that's because they lined the halls of the Kroll Opera House to try and intimidate those politicians, and obviously that was very effective because 444 voted in favour of it and only 94 voted against it. So they've been crucial in helping get the Enabling Act passed in March 1933. However, the SA are no longer as helpful by the time we get to July 1933, and that's because the law against the formation of new parties has been passed, which has outlawed every other political party except the Nazis. So remember, the SA's key role has been in helping to reduce political opposition and to act as this auxiliary police and arrest all of these left-wing opponents and kind of fight them publicly on the streets to make it seem like the Nazis are dealing with the communist threat. They don't really need to do that anymore. So they're just becoming quite frustrated, quite bored of the fact that they haven't really got anything to do. And they are causing problems unnecessarily. And they are causing lots of fights on the street with people that Hitler doesn't want them fighting with. Now, previously, they've been very helpful, but now Hitler is trying to establish himself as this really credible politician, and he's still trying to win over the conservative forces. The SA are now basically becoming this kind of embarrassing legacy of the years of struggle, to quote historian Bullock. And therefore, he doesn't really need them, and he doesn't really want them around anymore. They're also causing lots of problems because ROM and the SA are generally more left-wing than the rest of the Nazis. A lot of them believed in some of the socialist elements of the 25-point programme, and they wanted to take the Nazi so-called revolution further. You know, they were talking openly about there needing to be a second revolution. And they were growing quite frustrated with Hitler because they basically felt at this point that he was a bit of a sellout because he was now, making so many compromises with the right-wing conservative elites. And they didn't feel like that was kind of staying true to the nature of Nazism and the ideology of it. So there started to be this real tension between, the left wing of the Nazi Party and the more kind of right-wing elements of the Nazi Party as well. So Hitler was going to have to do something about this because they were causing problems, and he obviously had to try and pick between the SA or the conservative forces like the army. And he's also very worried about them because this is not a small group. After we get to January 1934, there are over 3 million of them. And obviously they're threatening his personal position as well as threatening the Conservatives. So tensions started to really increase, and the SA no longer were really necessary. And that led to the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934. As well as knowing about the cause of the Night of the Long Knives, it's also important that you know little bits about what happened and also their significance. Now, the Night of the Long Knives was an incredibly important event, as we can see from this quote from the historian Kershaw, who said that there were two crucial stepping stones to power, one being the Reichstag fire and the other being the Night of the Long Knives. Now, the reason why this event was so important is because it was when Hitler managed to crush political opposition both internally and externally. So he was able to get rid of the political opposition from the SA and to kind of consolidate his power over the Nazi Party itself by getting rid of the rival of Rom, who controlled 3 million members of the SA. But he's also able to try and get rid of external opposition as well. For instance, some people like conservative critics are arrested. People like von Kahr, who was obviously a critic of him and had also been responsible for causing the failure of the Munich Putsch, was also murdered on this night. So Hitler was able to consolidate power as a result of this, and able to get away with saying to the German people that he'd been the supreme judge and acted in their best interests. And people generally supported this. There wasn't very much of a backlash. People saw it as Hitler putting the country and the needs of Germany before even those that he was personally loyal to, and that put him in a more favourable position with members of the army, but also with some members of the population as well. So Hitler was able to gain legal acceptance for the murder of these opponents, and obviously it intimidates others. If Hitler's willing to kill members of his own party to consolidate his position, obviously he'd be willing to kill others as well. It's important that you know bits about the Night of the Long Knives. To get a grade B or above, it's really important that you understand the significance of the Night of the Long Knives. So first of all, this event was incredibly important because it marked a major shift in the development of Hitler's dictatorship. By carrying out this event, he was able to basically tame the left-wing radicals within the SA and very crucially to win the support of the elite, including the army. Now, obviously, the army had been quite hostile to Hitler in the past and had been very unsure about him and could have removed him by force after President Hindenburg died, or even before that. But this crucially wins their support because they realise that actually Hitler is going to be loyal to them and prioritise them even above groups that have been loyal to him since the founding of the Nazi Party. And it means that when Hindenburg dies on the 2nd of August 1934, there was no political chaos. The army didn't want to remove Hitler. Instead, what they ended up doing on the 2nd of August was signing and taking an oath of personal loyalty to Hitler, not to the country like they'd done previously. And Kershaw's described that oath of allegiance as being one where essentially there was a symbolic moment when the army chained itself to the Führer. So it's really crucial for the future of Germany, the creation of this police state, the fact that the army now is loyal to him. It's really representing this shift towards a dictatorship that maybe would have never happened if it hadn't been for this event. So it's certainly true that by the end of this event, Hitler has been the greatest winner. He's gained the acceptance from the German people for his actions, but he's also crucially gained the acceptance of the army. That was the end of us looking at the method of terror. We're now going to move on to the next method and think about legal methods. So we're going to go back to the emergency decree, or the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State, that was passed on the 28th of February 1933. Now, obviously, terror has been really important to the Nazi consolidation of power, but there is an element of legal methods as well, because the Nazis were very pragmatic and understood that revolution had to be achieved through legal means in order to be successful. Obviously, they'd learned from things like the Munich Putsch back in November 1923. So the day after the Reichstag fire took place, the Nazis were able to get a new law passed called the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State, but you can call it the Emergency Decree for short in exams. And this basically took away the rights and freedom of the German people that they'd been guaranteed as part of the Weimar Constitution. So they used to have the Bill of Rights that said that the citizens had lots of rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all those kind of things, no censorship. But now that's all been taken away because of the so-called communist threat. Because remember, when the Reichstag fire happens, the Nazis claim that it is the signal to start a communist revolution, and that's why Hitler gets these emergency powers. So the police can now arrest anybody under the illusion of putting them under protective custody, and they can keep them in custody for as long as they want. So there were 4,000 communists arrested in a week before the March elections, and 10,000 people arrested within 2 weeks of this law being passed. And they're not released afterwards. Many of them end up in the new concentration camps that are established from the late from late March 1933. So when we think about this event, it is technically a legal method of Hitler creating his dictatorship, but there is this element of it being pseudo-legal, and that's an argument you can use in an exam, that basically it might appear that it's a legal method, but it's very much based on terror. It's the Reichstag firing that act of terror that's got this passed, and obviously the Nazis use it to carry out this act of terror against the communists and to try and get rid of the left-wing opposition. So you can talk about it being pseudo-legal, or you could even talk about there being this use of violence balanced with a veneer of legality. So there's lots of legal methods we're going to look at. The first one is the Decree for Protection of the People and the State. The emergency decree had been passed a week before the March elections, which took place on the 5th of March 1933. Now, these elections had been pretty brutal. The Nazis had tried to maximise the use of the emergency decrees in that final week and had arrested 4,000 communists before the 5th of March. But it hadn't just been communists that had been arrested. There had also been lots of people that had died in street fights over political issues. And in the 5 weeks since they were announced, these elections, 69 people had actually died. The Nazis had created this atmosphere of fear and hate in their propaganda in order to try and win an overall majority. They particularly wanted to convince the middle classes to support them. There had been a lot of support already in 1932 from the lower middle classes, the Mittelstand, but they wanted to try and kind of tap into a wider audience and get more than 50% of the vote. And in order to do that, they'd used the Reichstag fire to maximum effect, and the historian Kershaw talked about how they created an anti-communist hysteria. Now, the Nazis were actually really disappointed with their share of the vote because they'd gone from having 33% of the vote in the November 1932 elections to having 44% of the vote. Obviously, that was the highest they had ever received, but it wasn't a majority. Therefore, they had to form a coalition with a right-wing party, the DNVP, in order to get that overall majority. Now, crucially, they do then get their support, which gives them 51% of the vote, and they are now able to control the Reichstag. Now, the Nazis are very aware that a coalition can be quite weak and not very long lasting, so their first priority was to try and get the Enabling Act passed, which was going to give Hitler many more powers, or much more power than any other chancellor had ever had. But he was aware that this was going to be a very controversial act, and therefore he decided that he wanted to meet with the conservative elites first, and he held a meeting to try and emphasise that he was doing this for the good of Germany and to basically win their support. But we'll think more about that meeting with the conservatives when we look at compromise later. We're now going to think about the Enabling Act, which is an absolutely crucial act to know about, and it's really important that you can tell the difference between this and the emergency decrees that were passed on 28th of February. So the Enabling Act was a fundamental change to the law of Germany, and it was passed on the 23rd of March 1933. Essentially, this allows Hitler to legally create a dictatorship. Yes, President Hindenburg is still around, and Hindenburg can still sack him at any point, but this gives Hitler the power to be able to completely bypass the Reichstag, and he uses the Enabling Act to be able to pass multiple laws that make him the dictator of Germany, including, once Hindenburg dies, passing a law that's saying he can be both Chancellor and President, which completely went against the original Weimar Constitution. So this was a really crucial change to the way that Germany was governed, and therefore it needed a 2/3 majority to get it passed. So Hitler took lots of action and used methods of terror to ensure that this act got passed. Now remember, he's been able to arrest anybody and put them into protective custody without having to have any actual evidence against them since the 28th of February, and within 2 weeks he'd arrested 10,000 people. By the time we get to the 23rd of March, which is when the Enabling Act is passed, he's basically already arrested or imprisoned all of the KPD leaders and deputies, and therefore there are only members of the SPD to vote against him when it comes to this vote. 12 SPD deputies were actually arrested, so they couldn't vote anyway. Now, the ones that could vote ended up having to walk past all these members of the SA who were standing in the corridors with their guns, who were basically intimidating these people into supporting the Enabling Act. Now, the SPD were the only party to vote against it, and so they didn't kind of respond to this intimidation. But other political parties, like members of the Centre Party, members of the DNVP, even things like the DVP, they all supported this act. And so this act was passed with 444 votes to 94 rejected it. It was obviously successful, and that is partly because of that use of terror. So we're going to come back to that term again of things being pseudo-legal. It might appear that this is a legal act, but there was definitely elements of terror that led to this being passed. So what did this act do then? Well, Hitler now had full legislative and executive powers of the cabinet and could now bypass the Reichstag for 4 years. So he basically had his own version of Article 48 of being able to pass whatever laws he wants without having to go to the Reichstag. And this allowed him to eventually create the one-party terror state. For instance, he used the Enabling Act to ban trade unions, which he does in May 1933. He also used this law to ban all other political parties, with the law against the formation of new parties in July 1933. And he also used this after Hindenburg died to create the role of Führer, or supreme leader, by combining the role of president and chancellor together. So the Enabling Act is absolutely crucial for creating this legal basis of his dictatorship, and it actually helped win over the support of some of the conservatives, because now they could see that there had been a Nazi takeover, but done in a way that appeared legal to them and therefore acceptable. So the Enabling Act, absolutely crucial to know what it was and how it was passed. We've now thought about 2 different laws that were passed that allowed Hitler to legally establish this dictatorship. We're now going to think about how he dealt with opposition legally, using those laws to his advantage. Now, Hitler generally disliked political parties because he saw them as a barrier to success, and he disliked how they represented small groups of people. What he wanted, and his vision for Germany, was this Volksgemeinschaft, this people's community of everybody being united together for one common goal of creating this greater Germany. And he wanted there to only be one political party that would represent the interests of the nation as a whole. Obviously, he wasn't thinking about everybody's ideas in that, but that was his view of what he wanted to create a successful Germany, about being united together. So he'd already carried out a lot of actions to achieve that. We've already mentioned lots of these, but I want to make sure that you're really clear on how he dealt with opposition and how he was able to legally establish that dictatorship. Now, obviously, we've already mentioned about how he used the Enabling Act to pass the law against the formation of new parties in July 1933 that outlawed all non-Nazi parties. But that wasn't his first action with doing this. That was the end product of this kind of gradual banning of political parties over time. So essentially, after the Reichstag fire, the KPD were effectively banned. Remember that they had the emergency decree, the Decree for Protection of People in the State from the 28th of February, where they were able to arrest 4,000 communists within a week. So by the time we get to even March, all KPD members had essentially been imprisoned, arrested, or had fled to other countries. On the 21st of June, after the SPD had voted against the Enabling Act, the SPD party were banned for being a party that was hostile to the nation and to the state, or at least Hitler's idea of what he wanted to create. Other political parties, like the DNVP and the Centre Party and the DVP, parties that had supported the Nazis with things like the Enabling Act, they all realised that their days were numbered, and they decided that it was in their interest to dissolve themselves before they were forced to dissolve. So actually, when it comes to the 14th of July, most other political parties have basically disbanded themselves anyway. And so that didn't make that great a change to what already was. But obviously, it's formally acknowledging the fact that there's only going to be one political party in Germany, which was a crucial step in creating that dictatorship. The final area you need to know about for legal is how the Nazis centralised power and took control over local government. Now, they were very aware at the beginning that they couldn't just completely take over local government and abolish it straight away, because that could lead to some opposition, particularly from the civil service. So instead, the Nazis carried out this gradual process where they removed the influence of local government over time. Now, local governments before the Nazis came to power in Weimar Germany and even in Imperial Germany under the Kaiser had actually had a fair amount of power. And that goes back to the fact that they didn't want to upset them after 1871 when Germany was unified. They didn't want to dictate everything from Berlin. So instead, they allowed them to have some autonomy. The Nazis wanted to remove that over time and did it through various stages, which you can see in this section on the process. So the first thing that they did was they basically inserted lots of Nazis into the state assemblies to make sure that they were controlling the conversation and make sure that they've got basically spies in there to see what people are saying about Nazis. So they're doing that very early on in March 1933. Then on the 7th of April, only a week or so later, they created a new position called the Reich Governor in every state, except in Prussia, because they'd already created one previously. Now, these people were responsible for ensuring that state governments followed the policies of central government. Basically, they were put in there to ensure that the local governments did as they were told by the central government in Berlin. And these people, who were these Reich governors, were generally all Nazis, and whether they were actually officially a member of the Nazi Party or not, their boss was the Minister of the Interior. Remember, that's one of the cabinet positions, one of the 3 positions the Nazis have, and that was done by Frick, who was a Nazi. So they've got Reich governors to make sure that they're listening to the rules that are coming from Berlin and Hitler, and they have to report to a Nazi. In the end, the Nazis decided that they could push it further by the time we get to 1934. Obviously, by that point, they've banned all other political parties. They've done things like got the Enabling Act passed. They've made great headway in establishing dictatorship. So they're feeling much more confident by 1934. And they decide that what they're going to do is abolish these state assemblies that have been around since the founding of Weimar and even before that as well. So now the government of each state basically had to listen to the central government. Final step was that the Nazis replaced the Reich governors most of the time with a new party position called the Gauleiters. And these were basically people who were trusted Nazis who were to make sure that local governments were doing exactly what the Nazis said, and they reported directly to Nazi party members in Berlin. Now, most of the time, these Gauleiters were previous Reich governors who then just changed the title of their position. But just to make things really confusing, the Nazis actually left the position of Reich governors in place in some areas. So in some cases, there was this real kind of power struggle between people that were the old Reich governors who were still around, and then also people that were these new Gauleiters that were basically Nazi party officials. So there was some aspects of where they had this kind of dualism, and we'll talk more about that when we look at the Nazi dictatorship, and we'll see how the government was quite chaotic. But essentially, the really key thing to know about how the Nazis controlled local government is that they get rid of the state assemblies and that they put these Gauleiters in place who then control the all aspects of local government essentially. We're now going to think about the third and final area, which is about how the Nazis compromised with the Conservatives, which includes their actions with the army, big businesses, and the civil service. Now, both sides benefited from this agreement, and there were a couple of things that they agreed on. First of all, generally the Conservatives in Germany at this point were anti-democratic, and therefore they liked some of Hitler's ideas, and they were also anti-communist as well. But obviously they weren't in full agreement. So Hitler needed to try and win them over, because Hitler also needs them for survival too. He needs the Conservatives to be able to stay in power and give his government law and order, stability, and also give it basically some legal authority with the fact that he's got their support. So they both need each other, and that is why we get the compromise between these two groups. And the Conservatives do some really important things that help Hitler establish his dictatorship. And we'll think more specifically about what they each do on the next few slides, but these points here are really important to understand as well, to think about generally how did the Conservatives compromise. So first of all, the Conservatives provided this kind of aspect of appearing respectable for the Nazis, and to make the Nazi seizure of power and dictatorship appear less revolutionary and more like a national revival of traditional interests. We also have events like Potsdam Day as well, which occurred a couple of days before the Enabling Act. This was basically a meeting, a public meeting of Hitler with lots of conservatives, including people like President Hindenburg, von Papen, Hindenburg's son, even the Kaiser Wilhelm II's son was there as well, which basically symbolised the marriage of traditional conservative elites with National Socialism. It was there to try and persuade the nervous middle classes that there would be no radical or revolutionary upheaval. Instead, the forces of old Germany were going to be working with this new force of Germany. We also have other things that Conservatives did, like the DNVP. Obviously, they had actually given the Nazis the majority that they needed in the March 1933 election, because the Nazis only had 44% of the vote, but when the DNVP gave them their share of the vote, they then got that overall majority, which helped to get things like the Enabling Act passed on the 23rd of March. So hopefully you can see that there are legal aspects of this dictatorship, there are aspects of terror, but also compromise comes into this as well. And there's definitely some overlap between these events where some aspects of it are about legal methods and some are about compromise as well. So that was a general introduction. We're now going to think about the different groups. The first conservative group we're going to think about is the army. Now, obviously, the army were a powerful force in Germany, and the army leaders had the power to remove Hitler from office. Technically, they were loyal to the head of state, the President Hindenburg, and therefore they could have removed Hitler on his orders or even without them if they so chose. So Hitler knew that he had to try and win over the army straight away if he was going to stay in that position. So it all began on the 3rd of February 1933, only a few days after Hitler became Chancellor, where he then had a dinner with the army's commander-in-chief, where he promised him that they would rearm Germany and retain the army's role as the most important institution of the state. So he was offering them what they wanted, their autonomy, their independence, them being able to increase the size of their army again. He also promised them that they would eventually expand into the east and kind of get back the old glory that the army once had before the First World War. So he was promising them a lot of what they wanted, but they were still unsure, even after that meeting, about whether Hitler would really deliver on what he was promising. Obviously, after we have the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had proven that he'd picked the army over the SA, and therefore the army leaders gave Hitler a free hand in establishing his dictatorship. Obviously, after President Hindenburg dies of ill health on the 2nd of August 1934, the army then swore an oath of personal loyalty to Hitler. And remember, Kershaw had talked about how they basically chained themselves to the Nazis. So the army did essentially sell out to Hitler and helped him establish a dictatorship. However, Hitler wasn't able to control them all straight away. The army had some kind of vestiges of independence up until 1938, and many of the army high command remained thoroughly conservative and aristocratic and still a little bit unsure about the Nazis, even after Hitler had established a dictatorship. But obviously they were still playing a crucial role in it. Even if they didn't fully support it, they essentially helped Hitler by giving him this free hand to establish it anyway. Another group to know about is the civil service. So the status of civil servants was generally on par with the army. The highest ranks of the civil service largely came from the aristocracy. And there were some points of convergence between both the Nazis and the civil service, as we've already mentioned, generally hating the idea of democracy and also being quite anti-communist as well. So there had been some civil servants that had actually welcomed the appointment of Hitler in January 1933. However, their support for Hitler was based on a misunderstanding that Hitler would appoint non-political expert people to run different aspects of the country, and they didn't quite know what was going to happen with the Nazi dictatorship. So Hitler didn't want to upset them too much and cause too much opposition straight away by replacing lots of the civil service. So instead he did it in kind of small sections by starting with the law for the re-establishment of professional civil service, which basically got rid of only a few civil servants, only people that were Jewish, people that belonged to the Communist Party, or people that were known to be socialists. And he essentially stopped them working for the civil service. But those laws weren't able to get rid of all left-wing and Jewish people that were part of the civil service, because, for instance, President Hindenburg said that anybody that had been a Jewish civil servant that had fought in the First World War, or whose fathers had fought in the First World War, were exempt from that rule. So he started to try and introduce this new Nazi version of the civil service, but wasn't, really effective straight away. So at first, the civil service were largely untouched, which represents an element of compromise by Hitler with the conservative forces in German society, because they essentially needed each other at this point, and Hitler realised he couldn't replace them all without causing outrage and opposition, and they knew that they needed to work with Hitler rather than against him. However, lots of civil servants, even if they weren't really supporting the Nazis in general, still joined things like the Nazi Party because they knew that they would get promoted quicker if they were officially a member of the Nazi Party. By 1934, when Hitler's feeling more confident in the consolidation of power and this establishment of a dictatorship, he then asked all of the new members of the civil service to swear an oath of loyalty to him, and only 5% of those that were asked refused and were therefore purged. So generally, the civil service compromised and remained largely untouched in the first years of the dictatorship. Hitler also compromised with the leaders of big businesses as well. Now, Hitler had needed the support of big businesses and had used them even before he became Chancellor, and he'd done lots of deals with anti-communist leaders to try and win support in terms of financial donations to Nazi Party for propaganda. But once he comes to power, he then needs the support of the big businesses to help him revive the economy after the Great Depression and help him basically establish, the work and bread that he's promised. He also needs them to fund things like the rearmament program that he's promised the army as well. So their support is really crucial. So he meets with them early on in his chancellorship on the 20th of February 1933 and ends up getting some donations of 3 million Reichsmarks to try and help him with the elections that are coming up in March, to be able to basically fund his propaganda again. So why would the big business leaders give the Nazis so much money? Well, obviously we know that they were anti-communists. Remember that this meeting is taking place, when the Communist Party are gaining quite a lot of support, and they've got their highest ever share of the vote in the last elections in November 1932 with 16.9% of the vote. So they were anti-communist and still worried about the communist threat at this moment in time, because obviously this is before Hitler has been able to arrest the communists for no reason at all, but also because the trade unions had been this powerful force in Germany in the 1920s, and the big business leaders wanted basically to dismantle those trade unions, which were causing them lots of problems. But just like the leaders of the army and the civil service, there were lots of big business leaders that were quite wary of the more radical idea of the Nazis, and there were some of them that were still quite hesitant to do business with Hitler and the Nazis. Now, in return for them getting these financial donations, in return for giving the Nazis these financial donations, Hitler then in return promised to stop any Nazi attacks on businesses. He also did things like banning trade unions using the Enabling Act in May 1933 and replacing them with the German Labour Front, which we will talk more about in Unit 4. He also just tried to kind of generally win them over by not only giving them what they wanted in terms of weakened trade unions and getting rid of the communist threat, but he also showed that he cared about the opinions of some of these big business leaders and these economists by doing things like hiring the very conservative man called Schacht as president of the Reichsbank. And this was a man that had been really important in ending hyperinflation in 1923. And therefore he was a very respected businessman. And Hitler also then appoints him to become economics minister in 1934, which again won the confidence of these big business leaders. Essentially, he does some deals with them that benefit both the big business leaders and the Nazi Party as well. Lastly, we're also going to think about the Catholics and how they compromise with the Nazi Party as well. So first of all, remember that we have the Centre Party who helped the Nazis pass the Enabling Act. They were part of the 444 votes that got it passed because they believed that that was in their best interest to support the Nazis on that, rather than standing in their way as opposition. Obviously, at that point, they'd watched what happened to the communists when they had opposed the Nazis, the fact that 10,000 of them had been arrested within a couple of weeks, and so they wanted to try and act to prevent that happening to themselves. For their cooperation, Hitler had reassured the church leaders that he would protect the rights and privilege of the Catholic Church, which then later led to a formal agreement called the Concordat that was signed in July 1933, where basically it said that the Centre Party would stay out of politics, and in return Hitler had to leave the Catholic schools and youth groups alone. We'll learn more about that when we do Unit 4. So they did have some common ground between them, but obviously this was about survival for the Catholic Party and for the Catholic religion, and for Hitler it was about trying to get rid of opposition peacefully because he didn't want to upset some of the German population. Obviously a large percentage of them were Catholic, and this could really alienate a lot of people if he dealt with them aggressively. So it was in both of their best interests that they dealt with this peacefully, and that led to the Concordat Agreement in July 1933. We've now talked through the different themes. Just wanted to emphasise here the importance of understanding the links between them, the fact that there is overlap and that some of the events might seem like they fit into one category, but there's actually an element of them fitting into multiple categories. For instance, if we think about something like the Enabling Act, there's an element there of obviously that being a legal act, with the fact that it gives Hitler the powers to pass whatever laws he wants for 4 years without the Reichstag. There's an element of terror there as well, in the sense that the SA lined the corridors and intimidated politicians into voting for it. But there's also an element of compromise too, with the fact that the Centre Party voluntarily did this because they wanted to kind of preserve their autonomy and their independence of things like Catholic schools. So each of the events fits into at least one of the categories. There are a few examples here of some answers of methods of consolidation, but that's not a perfect list. It's important that you think about what events fit into which categories, and if you made a timeline, it'd be a really good idea to colour code it into those 3 themes. It's also important to think about historians' views if you're aiming for an A or A star. So on here I've put some of the ideas that have been covered on some previous slides and a couple of new ones as well, just in case you want to be able to use these in any exam arguments. So pause the video here if you want to go through and add some examples to the rest of your notes on some historians' views. On the historian's views, we've got here some historiography, which again could be helpful, especially if you're aiming for an A star. So I'm going to very briefly talk through it. So essentially we have a few different ideas on this slide. We have the ideas of the structuralists, the intentionalists, and then Kershaw, who's basically a middleman between those 2 different schools of thought. So the structuralist view is one that emerged in the 1960s that basically believes that Hitler's dictatorship was a response to Germany's social and economic structures. Essentially, they don't think that the revolution really went far enough in 1918, and they believe that democracy wasn't really firmly established in Germany, and therefore it's not really that surprising that the Nazi dictatorship was created from 1933, because they basically hadn't created strong democratic institutions during the years of the Weimar Republic. The intentionists have a different idea and actually believe that the Nazi dictatorship wasn't inevitable, but actually it was just the result of Hitler basically being this kind of brilliant demagogue who had this mastery of political skills, who was able to outmaneuver the elites, and basically because of his political mastery was able to create a dictatorship that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So we've got structuralists who say that it was essentially inevitable because of the foundations of the Weimar Republic, and the intentionists argue that that's not actually the case. It was down to the individual nature of Hitler that he was able to establish a dictatorship. And then we have Kershaw in the middle, who in the 1990s basically tried to balance the two different views. And he suggests that there were some circumstances of the time that made it more likely for there to be a Nazi dictatorship, but also it wasn't inevitable, and there was an element of where Hitler also played this crucial role as well. And this is a really good quote to summarise Kershaw's thinking, where he suggests that chances and conservative miscalculation played a larger role than any of the actions of the Nazi leader himself. So he actually thinks that the conservative elites are more responsible for what happened than actually Hitler himself. Pause the video here if you wanted to make any notes about historiography. Another argument that historians have had is thinking about to what extent would we say there was a Nazi revolution. Obviously the essay Before the Night of the Long Knives were talking about how they wanted a second revolution because they viewed the first one as having existed. But you need to think about your own argument and whether you would say the Nazi dictatorship and kind of the Nazis coming to power was actually a revolution or not. Now, I'd strongly suggest if you ever get an exam question like this, that you define what you mean as a revolution, and you might think about the fact that a revolution generally means a fundamental change, an overturning of existing conditions, or you might define it slightly differently, but it's worth thinking about how you would define it before you do the next bit of making some notes on whether there was or wasn't a revolution. So here we've got some arguments for it being a revolution and arguments against. It'd be worth pausing the video here, having a quick read of them, and then writing down your own thoughts on your revision spider diagrams or just on a post-it note in your books about whether you think it actually counts as a revolution or whether you think that it doesn't. So think about, would you say the Nazis had a revolution? Don't forget you've also got access to the short answer test, which has now got 30 questions on it, which go through all of the key details that you need to remember. So it'd be a good idea to make flashcards if you haven't already, and regularly test yourself that you know these crucial facts. Well done for getting to the end of this quite long video. Hopefully now you're feeling a bit more confident about the knowledge for consolidation of power, but it's really important that you're now doing some active revision to make sure that you remember this and that you could do a really good job if it comes up in a mock exam, a class test, or the real exam. So make sure you're now doing something with it. If you haven't already made some revision materials, go back and use the information on the slides. Even if you turn the audio off, you can use it to make things like Cornell grids, or you can make a mind map, revision clocks. All of these kinds of things will really help you to remember the information. You can then use those grids to do things like red pen, black pen activities, where you write down everything you can remember without looking at your notes in one colour, and then you go back and see what you missed and you add it in a second colour. And then once you've done those kind of activities and you're feeling more confident with the content, you could then have a go at writing out a full answer, or even just doing a plan, an introduction, conclusions. There's loads of different questions on consolidations in your Teams booklets, but there's also one here that would be a great example to have a go at. And remember, that is the best form of revision that you can do. Well done for listening to the video, but now make sure that you're going away and doing something to help you learn it.